All right, how's everybody doing? My name is Adrian Aragonas. I'm a professor in the Department of Chicano Studies at the University of Texas El Paso. And so I'm here today to discuss what I think is an interesting topic, reference the U.S. Constitution. It's actually the Texas v. Hernandez court case that took place in 1954. So again, briefly, the title of my topic is the Revisiting Texas v. Hernandez, Mexican Americans in the U.S. Constitution. And so this particular court case is fascinating, and you don't have to be a nerd about history like myself to really see not only that this is interesting, but why this is important, specifically to Americans and more specifically to Mexican Americans in the U.S. So what this court case does is it actually argues the fact that Mexican Americans up until 1954 were considered second-class citizens, which by definition means they are not American citizens. Because American citizens under the Constitution say simply that you are afforded these rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights and the Constitutions and the related amendments. And so what is this court case? What does it do? So again, what it does is it argues that Mexican Americans are in fact American citizens, period, and they are to be afforded any and all benefits and privileges that are associated with protection under the U.S. Constitution. And so why did this happen? What was going down? I mean, we live in America, you're born in America, shouldn't you be citizens? Well, that's the argument that these guys make. So to set up the story of what happened, there was this individual named Peter Hernandez. And what Peter Hernandez did was, in an argument, he shot a man in cold blood, took a shotgun right to the chest, and that was it. Now, there's no doubt that he was guilty. There were witnesses and everything, but here's the issue. In this country, we're afforded due process, meaning that there is a method and a procedure that comes into play. Some people like to say there's a rule of law. And so the rule of law says that you are innocent until proven guilty. And even if we know that you did it, you are still afforded this right because that is part of being an American. There is a process to guarantee that your rights are not violated. So again, it's important to understand, even in the event that you're guilty, there's still a process, right? Once upon a time, somebody was guilty, they'd take them, they'd lynch them, they'd shoot them, these things, and then later find, whoops. And I know that's mean to say, but in essence, that's what they did. Because once you kill a person, that's it. Once you put them in jail and they lose 10, 20, 40, 60 years of their life, what is it that you're going to do? And so these are the things that are afforded, provided through the Constitution. So what happened with Peter Hernandez is that he went to court, but the problem was that all his jurors, by definition, were white. And so his lawyers argued, well, wait a minute. We know that he's guilty. We know that he did it, but everybody's still afforded this due process. So why are there no Mexican Americans or Americans of Mexican descent on this trial? Because again, the law is very clear. You are afforded a right of a trial through a jury of your peers, meaning that the people who are going to serve as jurors to decide whether or not you're guilty or whatever the case may be, that they are like you, so that there's no bias, right? And so in Peter Hernandez's case, all the folks on there by definition were white. So when the lawyers said, wait a minute, we need to have Mexican Americans on this jury, if only to make this legit, and people argued, well, you all are white. Like, wait a minute, who's white? And the courts, legal officials who were white would say, well, you Mexican Americans are white. Mexican Americans would say, well, no, we're not, because we're segregated. And those of us who are from El Paso Juarez, El Paso was segregated once upon a time. In fact, there's a very infamous sign. Feel free to Google it. You could put no Mexicans allowed, El Paso, Texas. And there's a very famous sign that pops up at night from, I believe it's 1919. It says no Mexicans allowed. And in different parts of Texas, different parts of the United States, no Mexicans, no dogs, no blacks, no Negroes, this type of thing. Now, let me be clear, and this is just my opinion. But people will quick to say, well, that's how things were back then. Yeah, but that doesn't justify it. Well, that's how things were at that time. The moment that an individual today looks at something in the past and simply says, well, that's how they did things, that's not true. It's true that those things happened, but to say that that's how things were is to assume that, well, they happened because everybody was in agreement with it. As a side note, slavery, for example. Well, that's just how they were. No, it wasn't. There's records of slave revolts from the slaves themselves and people who were not slaves that opposed slavery almost every day. Slavery existed for almost 300 years. Think about that. Did you know that? Did you know that there was some sort of uprising, something that protested slavery? Imagine that. That's for almost 300 years, every day. Did you know that? We know about a few things that happened here and there. We know about the Civil War. But other than that, people assume that, well, it was a few things that started the war and then slavery was over. From day one, the moment that they brought the first slave, there was resistance towards it because people knew it was wrong. Unfortunately, the people in power were able to make sure that slavery stayed an issue for centuries on end. Okay, so my point here is we have to be careful when we say, well, that's how things were, because we're assuming that everybody was okay with it. Even the people who were slaves, or in this case, Mexican Americans who were discriminated, well, they were okay with it. No, they weren't. They were not. And this is why this is so important, right? This country affords us rights as American citizens and permanent residents, right? Because there are people who live in this country who, I myself was one, you're here legally, but you're not a citizen. So you have all the rights and privileges, protection under the Constitution. The only difference is you cannot vote. You can be drafted, but you cannot vote. Okay? So just to be clear. So the Constitution is there for a reason, and it's a very strong document. It's one of the most copied documents in human history, in Western human history. But again, that's another lesson, another lecture for another day. That being said, so in particular, our court case, sorry for going sidetracked, but I like to give context so that we understand why these things are important. So Mexican Americans, the court case of Texas v. Hernandez is about Mexican Americans and who they are as a people, who they are as identity, who they are as an American. One question I always ask my students is, if we're all American, why the hyphenated Mexican American? Why African Americans? And if you think for a minute, you'll notice and you'll see all the groups are hyphenated except one. And the question is why? Okay. So what happened with this particular court case is that you had a group of individuals that came together, veterans, U.S. veterans out of World War II. Now, this is important to understand because the court case happens in 1954, several years after the end of World War II. In World War II, Mexican Americans made up a large number of the soldiers that went to go fight in the Pacific theater against the Japanese Empire and in the European theater where they fought against the Nazi Third Reich. And so people like my grandfather were World War II veterans. My grandfather was from El Paso, born and raised. He volunteered, went to the army, ended up being participating in arguably one of the most famous campaigns/battles of United States warfare, and that was D-Day, June 6, 1944. And my grandfather, his words, by the grace of God, survived that. And this is important to understand because, again, to say that, well, that's how things were, that Mexicans were discriminated against. You had people that were going to war, black, Mexican, you had women that were part of the wartime effort, and these folks were expected to participate as Americans, but when it came to society, they were not treated equally. Hence the argument that Mexican Americans were treated as second-class citizens. So the gentleman who argued the court case, Gus Garcia, and there were several other individuals. One was Carlos Cadena. Carlos Cadena will be the first Mexican American Supreme Court justice at the state level. And then you have, look at my notes, always got to have my notes. You'll also have John Herrera, and you will have James de Anda. And these are all individuals, and I know Gus Garcia was a veteran. I believe that the larger part of the larger team, a good chunk of those men were World War II veterans. Now, again, you have to think about that. These are World War II veterans. They went to fight against the Nazis, and we know what the Nazis did: the Holocaust and the concentration camps and the issue of race. Imagine soldiers going to fight to get rid of that, and then they come home and they're discriminated against because of race. At some point, something's going to give, and there were many efforts. And this was not the first effort that people said, wait a minute, you're treating Mexican Americans differently. In 1931, you have the Lemon Grove incident, which was a court case where children, because they were viewed as Mexican, not Mexican Americans, although many of them were born and raised in the United States, they were denied the ability and opportunity to go to a public school in the United States. And it had to go to the state level Supreme Court, where the justice said, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't do that to these kids just because you think they're Mexican, because they look a certain way, you think that they deserve to be discriminated against. So these things are layered one on top of the other, and you have these different court cases that end up building into something larger. And the largest court in the United States is the Supreme Court. Now, keep in mind, the Supreme Court doesn't determine guilt or innocence. What it does is it ensures that your rights and my rights are not violated. The Constitution is there. The Bill of Rights are there. Remember, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments that were created at the implementation of the Constitution. And that's a contract, a social contract, if you will. There's 10 rights. Of the 10, sorry, I like to do this, I'm a teacher. Of the 10, 9 of them deal with individual liberties. That's how passionate the founders were. That's how precious and important our constitutional rights are. So you have the freedom of speech, the right to assembly, freedom of the press, things of these nature, right? Of the 10 things, 9 of them deal with things that protect me, that protect you as American citizens, as people living in the United States, right? There is a policy and a procedure. Nobody's above the law, and nobody can be cast outside of the law, especially if they're American citizens or people living legally in the United States. And so what Gus Garcia did, and his team, they managed to take this to the state court, to the state level Supreme Court. And here's a real interesting note. When they're making their case, the state Supreme Court basically says, but you all are white. And Garcia's team argues, well, that's what you say, but the way we're seen and the way we're treated, two different things. It's either we're Americans or we're not, because Americans have to be treated the same way. And if you're not American, then there has to be a reason. And so another side note is that while they were arguing that in the state Supreme Court, they're being told that they're equal, and then during a break, they went to the bathroom. They couldn't use the bathroom that was in the courthouse because that was for white men only. They had to go around the back to use the bathroom for people of color. Think about that. They're being told one thing, but they're treated another. Laws exist, but how they're enforced and how they're interpreted are a different thing. Now, that's not my opinion. This is historical fact. This is what the court case of Texas v. Hernandez is about, right? And many times people say, well, that happened so long ago. Think about this. I was born in 1969, so that makes me a semi-dinosaur. My parents were born in 1940, 45, and 46, respectively. My grandfather was born in 1917. So I'm assuming that you folks, I'm about your parents' age, give or take, right? And so your grandparents would be the age of my parents. What I'm trying to say is that in 1954, okay, your grandparents were alive when Mexican Americans were not allowed to go into specific places because they were Mexican American. It's not that far removed. It's not. Your great-grandparents were part of the generation, assuming you're all high school students. I know we have people from all over, so apologies there. But for our young brothers and sisters in high school, our scholars, current scholars, and our current scholars who are going to pursue their endeavors, are not that far removed. You're maybe 2 generations away, if we can call it that. So your parents may have experienced it. I was growing up, and I was a child, little guy, in 1970. I was in school when they started the busing. In my school where I went, they were busing in, as they called it, African Americans. Why? Because they were trying to get rid of segregation. So here you have a teacher talking to you who actually saw this firsthand, right? Which means your parents were experiencing this, maybe not immediately, but they were living at the time when this was going down. And your grandparents definitely saw it, and your great-grandparents absolutely experienced it one way or another. We had that here in El Paso. Okay. And so the idea behind Texas v. Hernandez is what makes it important. Thomas Paine, a patriot from the American Revolution, once said, "You cannot kill an idea with an army." And that's a very powerful statement. And that was something that Garcia was actually challenging, this idea that Mexican Americans, for some reason, were not viewed as citizens. They weren't. The laws were there. Look it up, Google it. I challenge you to go ahead, find out. There's different things that were going down. They were sending people to war. Young men were going to war. So, for example, you probably don't know that one of the most decorated, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the most decorated World War I veteran to come out of Texas was Mexican. Think about that. His last name was Serna. And Mr. Serna was a person, and this is how things repeat themselves and they tie themselves in. Mr. Serna, as the story goes, Mr. Serna was working in the fields in I believe, in central East Texas, more probably towards the valley. And he was an undocumented worker. And when he was caught, he was given the option, either we will deport you or you will serve in the army. At the time the war was going on. And he said, well, I don't want to, I need to do this, so I'm going to join the war. Now, it's interesting that he joined the war because we have to question whether or not he volunteered, because he didn't speak English. He didn't have, I think he had a very basic education. I don't know that he went to elementary school. My point is that he joins the military, joins the military, and he fights in World War II, fights in Europe, and he becomes the most decorated Texas war veteran in World War I. But you don't know that because it's not in your history books. These are things that affect what I like to talk about as the perception and perspective. The perception is how we think about things. Perspective is how we see things. And they're not always connected, right? And this is what is part of the idea that impacts the way people saw and thought about Mexican Americans. And so Gus Garcia and his team goes before the court. They make the argument and they say, look, we're treated as second-class citizens. You send us to war. You expect us to go to war. You expect us to pay taxes. You expect us to follow the law. We do all these things that's asked of us and required of us. And still, we can't go into a place because we look a certain way, because you think that I'm not from here, right? And this still exists today. How many times on the border do you think people get looked at and they say, oh, I wonder if he's legal. I wonder if he's Mexican. You have a community here in El Paso called Segundo Barrio, Second Ward, South El Paso. People assume that all the Mexicans live there. Did you know that a good chunk of World War II veterans come from Segundo Barrio? Now, whether they were born in Mexico or not is irrelevant if they're veterans, because they're citizens. And yet the perception and the perspective is one thing versus the reality. Why does that exist? But I'll leave that food for thought for you all. To the court case, they make a really good court case. Now, here's a really other interesting point. Remember I mentioned earlier that they'd gone before the state Supreme Court. They were making their argument. It was really interesting because one of the justices that was presiding over the case leans over and he says, do you all need a translator? And Gus Garcia is like, I like to imagine they look at each other like, this guy. And he responds to the judge. He says, "Well, Judge, we all speak English, but if you need a translator, maybe we can find one for you." Right? It was like, boom, that's what you get. Again, even a person who is quote unquote well educated is a state level Supreme Court justice, which is a really amazing feat. Really, still has an ignorant mindset. Ignorant is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that there's a lack of information or a reliance of incorrect information. Really, the guy was just wrong. And so the case from there ends up going to the to the Supreme Court of the United States. And there, Gus Garcia and his team, and this is no easy feat. You have to understand, it cost a lot of money. I think the estimate, I'm not even going to give you a dollar amount. I want to say that's in the hundreds of thousands at the time, but I've heard that now it costs about $1 million to get up there, but don't take me on it. That's just hearsay. My colleagues in political science and lawyers, I'm a historian by training. The lawyers, I'm sure, could better versed than that. But the point here is that the community came together. People were donating, 50 cents, $1. People who had little to no resources were donating money because they understood what this was about, and they helped those lawyers get to the Supreme Court. So they get to the Supreme Court. And here's another interesting tidbit. History's fun if you know where to look and if you have the right people talking to you about it. So when they're in front of the Supreme Court, you only get 30 minutes to present your court case. Think about that. This is a court case that's going to really impact the Mexican American community. This is about Mexican Americans being acknowledged as American citizens. Imagine if the court case needed to say was won. Imagine if it was lost. Segregation is still in full play. And you get 30 minutes to discuss your case. This is why when your teachers now tell you about good writing, listen to them. You got to know how to articulate, right? You got to be able to take in your ideas, synthesize them, break them down, and articulate. So as a side note, this business of, well, I'm shy, I don't like to talk. If you're not shy, you're never going to get that date. If you're shy, you're never going to get that job. Just a little FYI, okay? So that aside, Gus Garcia gets up there and he gives the speech of his life. Problem is that he's going, and then there's this buzzer that just goes off. When the buzzer goes off, you got to stop. Mid-sentence, you're not finished, it doesn't matter. You have to stop. For the first time in the history of the Supreme Court, I'm almost positive this is true, but I believe Gus Garcia was the first person. Chief Justice Warren, that's the justice who is in charge of all the other justices, leans over and he says, "Mr. Garcia, continue." Later, the retelling of the story, the other lawyers were like, wow. And Garcia just kept going. So the court case is going to be, let me look at my notes. The court case will be argued losing my notes here. Oh, here we go. It's argued on January 11th, 1954, and the decision is going to be made May 3rd, 1954, in favor, ruling that Mexican Americans cannot be segregated. They cannot be treated as second-class citizens. So it's a huge, huge victory. Sadly, though, this wasn't the only battle. Like I said earlier, 1931. And you have other court cases that are going to still come after the fact. Keep in mind, Mexican Americans is a term and idea that happened at the end of the U.S.-Mexico War. The U.S.-Mexico War ends in 1848. At the end of the war, there's a treaty, and the treaty is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it lays out basically the rules of what's going to happen next. And here's, again, some more what I think is some interesting food for thought. So the war ends, and there are, you know the story. I know my colleagues at the high school level got this locked down. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, and all these other states formerly belong to Mexico. Once the war is over, Mexico basically says, okay, it's done. But we need to know what's going to happen to the people who live there. And credit to the United States to an extent, and I'm oversimplifying, but for the sake of time and the sake of argument, the United States says, all right, so the people who are living here who are Mexican citizens, if you want to stay, you stay and you become American citizens. If you don't want to become American citizens, you got to go. Check this. the majority of the people stayed. Some are obvious reasons, right? Your children are there, your work is there, you buried your parents there, all these other things. They did that. But already something was coming, because the New Mexico territory, and the part that would become New Mexico, is the first territory to really get it together. So once the war is over, there's all this territory. The United States says, you know what? Okay, all these territories, you want to be part of the United States. Here's an application. Here's the rules and regulations. They're not going to get turned down. They just have to set it up, so that the idea is that once you set it up and we come in, everything is running smoothly. We just connect you to us and we flow straight. So New Mexico was one of the first states to do that. Okay. After the U.S.-Mexico War in 1848, and I believe in 1849 they were ready. They do not become a state until after, I believe, after World War I, in the 1917. So it's in the midst of World War I. Why is that? Why is that? No, there's a lot of factors that played into that. But there was this perception that, well, you got to have certain people in the right positions of power. New Mexico was organized. It had everything that it needed for the most part. Not perfect, but it was one of the first territories ready to go. And yet they're one of the last states accepted into the Union, right? There's one of two historians. I think one is, last name is Brinkley. The other guy is Foner. I remember when I was in graduate school, the opening to the U.S. history book, they tell a story of a woman who in New Mexico had a baby, and back in the day before computers, yes, there was a period before internet, smartphones, and Wi-Fi. She called, and you get a social security number, which is basically your ID number saying that you're a U.S. citizen. So the woman calls to have her child get a social security number. She talks to the operator, assumingly it's another part of the country. And the woman says, yes, I'd like to apply for a social security card for my child. And the person on the other line says, sure, where was your son born? And the woman responds, well, my son was born in New Mexico. And right away, the operator says, I'm sorry, ma'am, we only issue social security cards to children born in the United States. I'll just leave a moment of awkward silence. Born in the United States, New Mexico. Hello. But there you are. The perception and perspectives that people have are old, and they're still reoccurring. With Mexican Americans were the first people of ancestry who was not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant to become U.S. citizens. So since 1848, Mexican Americans have existed, and that's a whole other conversation to have. But interesting, Mexican Americans did not choose their name, as far as we could tell. That's a name that was imposed on them, because as far as they were concerned, okay, I'm American now. What are you going to do? As soon as you had the gold rush, the movement from east to west, people who were not familiar with these new people, these new citizens, really created and imposed the name. Think about that. Mexican American. First of all, if we're all Americans, why the hyphenation? Number two, if we're Americans, why not American Mexicans or American Africans? Why put the identifier / qualifier first? Awkward silence moment. These are things that need to be thought about. There we go. Thought about. But this is the beauty of conversation. This is the beauty of having a Constitution Day. This is awesome that your teachers, our staff, the admin at UTEP, we bring it together to have these conversations. It's not about hashing up hate, hashing up old grudges. Absolutely not. The key to understanding things is exactly that, to understand. We have to have an open mind. Just because we understand it doesn't mean we accept it, doesn't mean we agree with it. It simply means that we're avoiding that moment of ignorance, whether it's a moment in the immediate moment that it's occurring or historical moments down the ways, right? You had other court cases that were going on. So I'm just going to defer to my notes here quickly. Very famously, we have in 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act, which people assume, well, that's when things became more equal. just kind of leave that there again, food for thought. But also, you have other court cases. You have Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, which is a court case by Thurgood Marshall, where it was for the desegregation of that favored African Americans, because we know African Americans were regarded as second-class citizens. A lot of what was happening then, we're seeing it now. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm not saying that there are sides to be taken. What I am saying is that a lot of what we're seeing now has already happened. So what does that say if we have these things reoccurring, right? The old cliche tells us the more things change, the more it stays the same. Or in history, if we don't learn from our history, we're destined to repeat it. Okay. You have a court case. You have a woman, 19, let me refer to my notes here. You have a court case, Mendes versus Westminster. And that court case was argued in February of 1946. So before 54, you had the court case of Mendes versus Westminster, where again, it was a Latina woman who, as a child, was denied access to a school. And her parents fought it tooth and nail, and they won. But it changed. There were changes for the immediate community, but not for the country as a whole. Right? In fact, Miss Mendes, later in life, in 2011, won the what is it? Sorry, let me just get my notes here. She will be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's a huge thing, right? Very much like the young women, the students at Little Rock that were black students that went into white schools. Miss Mendes was first. This is a story that's not specific to any one group. But we can say that the story happens, the same story is happening to specific groups, not all groups, right? So the significance of the Texas v. Hernandez is premised on this idea of identity, perception, and perspective. Again, the perception and perspective is my take and how I interpret and teach and talk and discuss and think about the Texas v. Hernandez. So in some folks, closing up here, Texas v. Hernandez was a court case that was argued in 1954. It won. It argued that Mexican Americans were not second-class citizens and should not be treated as such. The courts agreed. At the time, Chief Justice Warren, the decision was unanimous, and it was so. But again, always remember, there's a difference between what the law says and the way it's interpreted and the way to what degree it's enforced, right? And so while the court case was won in 1954, a lot of the issues were still continuing. They were continuing as early as 1931, as I mentioned, with the Lemon Grove incident. Kids were denied public schools. And you have court cases that really span not too far from where we are now. So you have, for example, 1976. It's Prieto versus Priest. Same thing. Schools are not allowed. The way money is used to fund schools is done so in an unfair manner based on who lives where and who's going to what school. These are things that are still in a need for discussion. And I think this is great. This is great that we have this conversation, that we're able to discuss this. Obviously not back and forth, but this is something that needs to be said, and we have to keep going. Otherwise, as we are witnessing, history will repeat itself. You don't have to like what's going on. You don't have to agree with what's going on. But I challenge you to try to understand it. Because if we associate ourselves with people that have common ground, which is a beautiful thing, don't get me wrong. But if we don't step out of that comfort zone, then what are we really going to change? What are we going to challenge? Rosa Parks did not. She was tired. Didn't go to the back of the bus. She said no, and she stood her ground, and look what happened. Right? Gus Garcia challenged it. Miss Mendes challenged it. And I'm going to leave you with a quote, folks. So I'm going to read from my notes. And this is what Ms. Mendes said. That we are all individuals. That we are all human beings. That we are all connected together. And that we all have the same rights and the same freedoms. thank you for tuning in, and really appreciate you guys giving some time, guys and gals alike, everybody in the mix. It was really fun. I really enjoyed doing this. Hopefully we'll see you. You guys are on campus. Look me up. My name is Adrian, Aragonas, Adrian, Adrian. I'm good either way. Out of Chicano Studies. As sure my colleagues who are also participating in this, reach out, have a question, not a problem. And if ever you guys want to have a chat, a Zoom conference, let your teachers know. Have them contact us over at Chicano Studies, and more than happy to accommodate you where and when we can. All right? You all be safe. You all be healthy. You all take care. Hang in there. It's a new learning environment, but you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. All right? Take care, guys.